like a passion project. Like, I mean, just you talking about it, I'm like, whoa, that's so cool.
Yeah, no, it started out as just like, as everything else, like one quick conversation. I have experience in the music business prior to this life here. And I was like, yeah, let's try to figure it out. Let's see what we can do here.
Perfect. Kind of like you said earlier, it's literally feels like there's not a better pairing.
Thanks, thank you.
You ain't heard this since before Ye was voting Republican. I'm back behind the boards, tell the real, I said it's up again. D-born rappers, I come around, better tuck it in. My verses take you high before Snoop could light up a blunt again. Who you know consistent is me, that boy nasty with the pen, but he cold with the beats. On everything, I'm everything that they pretending to be. See, I see gaps in their story, why they lie through their teeth?
Maybe it starts with me. I relocated here from LA in 2010. With my wife and daughter. My wife's originally from here. I didn't know anyone here. And so I decided to use a new feature on Dribbble, which at the time was more of a social network for designers. Hopped on there, I found a handful of people, ran into his profile and was like blown away by his work. I usually don't like to reach out to total strangers on the internet because that could be weird, right? But decided to do that. Turned out that we lived really close to one another. And we decided to get together and have a burger and some beers. And that turned into like a 3-4 hour conversation. Like we both think about design the same way. And that started a friendship and then a working relationship, which eventually evolved into what is now Heavy Heavy.
The rest is history, I think.
Yeah.
I just remember seeing Erik get out of his car in the parking lot. I think we're at Flying Saucer, right? Keebner Oaks. And he was dressed basically the same that I would wear. And it was just, I don't know, it just felt meant to be. It was good.
You talk about like don't exploit culture and don't prey on fear and insecurity. How do you ensure that your work always aligns with these values? Like, how do you follow that?
You have to be very cognizant of what you're doing, right? So much about design are the decisions you're making and why you're making them. So those are questions we ask ourselves, we ask each other, the perfect checks and balances amongst the two of us. Yes, it can be easily done if you're not cognizant of that, right?
Yeah, I think for both of us, we're sensitive to kind of all the angles, so we want to make sure that if we're telling a story, we're telling it with the correct perspective, right? Like that's representative or with empathy. And so I think it's being intentional, right? And being conscious of what those angles are and what things mean and what they can mean if they're used, if it's symbolism or something that's used inappropriately, right? Like finding what that correct balance is. That's an everyday task though, so.
Yeah, when I met with you previously, we talked about balancing art and utility and how that's something that you guys really have to, as graphic designers, like focus on and make sure that you're doing something that is aesthetically pleasing and looks good, but also is functional.
Function, right? Does it work, right? First and foremost. For me, at least, every decision I'm making is as objective as I can possibly be, right? I'm human, so obviously, even though my wife may say I'm a robot, I'm not. And I want to make sure that I'm not decorating, right? Because there's a big difference, right? Does my design choice serve the objective? Does it make sure the design works, right? Does it get in the way? If it gets in the way, it doesn't belong there, right? If it allows for an easier use of the design, then it belongs there.
Yeah, I think that's the chief concern is function. Everything is going to flow from there, right? So it's like down to if it's the last step and being color choice, right? We're going to choose colors based on it working to serve the purpose of the overall design, if that makes sense, right? You'll use red to indicate certain values, right? Like if it's stop or caution or warning or whatever. Using a different color would obviously indicate a different meaning. Balancing, what I guess where fashion can come into it and decoration is how you use red in that instance, right? Like, what is the container for it and how does it get repeated in some kind of logical system, right? It still has to look good, right? Like, it has to feel right. I think people will buy and use things that are designed poorly in terms of function, right? Like they only barely work or they are expected to fail after a very short amount of time. But if it's designed to look a certain way, they'll still pick it up and use it, right? So where we're trying to, aim all of our work is to marry both of those pieces so that you have quality things that do a thing and something that you're happy to use.
Something that I'm curious about, I feel like the industry is ever evolving, especially with micro trends, and there's a lot of micro trends lately. How do you get away from that? How do you keep up with innovation like that?
That's been the case in design from the very first time it was turned into a discipline in a career. I think as a designer, what you have to be cognizant of, what are those trends? Trends are tools like every other tool that's in our toolbox. They're not a means to an end though, right? Just because something is a trend doesn't mean it needs to be adopted and then splashed across whatever project you have in front of you, right? Like that's a dangerous way to be a designer. Yeah. There might be some short-term gains there for you, but I've seen time and time again designers who embrace a trend that once that trend is no longer in flavor, now what?
Yeah, your work is immediately dated or it ceases to function as appropriately as it used to, right? I think trends are good, like they're a thing that they'll always happen, but it's a matter, like Erik's saying, is using the right trend for the right thing, I guess, and at the appropriate time. So for us, it's a communicative value, right? Like if that trend works and it has staying power, especially for whatever that communication asset is, if it's a product or whatever, then it has a lot more value to us than kind of just something pedestrian happening in the design world, right?
I always found it ludicrous when I would see people would ask us, well, have you ever designed for X? We design for humans, right? Like that's first and foremost. I being a human, last time I checked, means that I'm qualified to design for another human. Based on my experience, based on my knowledge, I am 100% qualified to design for another human. Whether that human is someone that's interacting with something in medical or robotics or an alcoholic beverage or a caffeinated beverage, it doesn't matter, right? It starts first the fact that I'm human. I have experience doing design. I understand design thinking. We're good to go.
To me anyway, and for me, it's less about like digging, finding a certain thing within myself, you know what I mean? I think if it was purely artistic, then that would be the case. Like I would need to kind of internally know about what I want to express, but we're working the opposite direction, right? Like from the client's customer or from the client's audience's perspective back to what we do. So it flows pretty naturally when we work in that process because we're making decisions based on what they need to know, based on what they need to see. So it's less about like, oh, are they, is it real estate or robotics or beverages or something like that. It's like a human is going to consume this data or this product or this service. How do we approach them in a way that resonates with them, right?
Yeah,
And then it's easy after that.
Yeah.
what are some of your favorite designs that you've done that you look at it and you're just like, yeah?
Plus One is still pretty dope to me. That was like a real all hands on deck, and in the last hour it was like, oh, it's perfect. Like we have a little sticker of it right there. It's just came together very elegantly, I think.
Tony, my kids ask me that all the time. For me, I have to divorce myself of the work once it's done. It's almost like a cleansing, so that I'm not.
So you're not offended later?
Well, no, but it's because I don't want to bring that with me to the next thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so I try to kind of flush it so that I'm open up myself for the next project that's on board.
When it comes to projects that were like already started, like the Betty one, how do you manage that thought process? Like, oh, I don't want to copy Betty, but I want, they want us to create something new and fresh. Like, how do you, I guess, manage that tradition, but also with innovation?
That one was a little difficult, I think, because there was no plan to do another pinup until there was, right? So we, as a matter of course, we want to know all things before we start a project, right? Especially if it's going to be part of a whole somehow. Like, there's a lot more detailed research and thought process needs to go into kind of all things, really, type, color theory, right? Like, what are the symbols that you're going to use to represent things? If you make multiples of A, right, how do you represent the changes in that series? So talking to the Dorchel folks and their high wheel brand, it was just a good fit, I think, because they were at a place where they wanted to release a new beer. We were at a place where we had ideas for a new beer, and we kind of approached them at the right time, and it all kind of came together. So I think it was more a challenge for us to follow our own tradition. What do you call it in comic books where they like make something true?
Retcon.
Yeah, we had to retcon our own work, right? So that the sequel still made sense with the original.
You feel like your vision aligned with what Dorcel had in mind? I mean, that's how you create a great product.
Absolutely. I think it's a matter of getting the right feedback with the right questions, though, right? It's like there are certainly tasks within the process that a client should not have anything to say about, right? It's like, that's what you hired us to make those decisions, right? So those types of discussions, I think, in feedback loops, we consider kind of minutia. It's like, we could talk about the differences between, 2% kern between these letters and a 5%, but like, you should just trust that we know what we're doing in that regard, right? I think when it comes to stylistic things, we get as much initial discovery from the client as possible. And so that makes it a lot easier for them to say yes to everything, right? But yeah, it's been positive. I think it's fun to see it on shelves and see it in my local H-E-B when it's there. It's just a good, I don't know, it's like a nice little hometown vibe, so.
One, I do believe in the democratization of design. Like, if you truly are passionate about it, if this is something that you really want to do, we want to be able to be a resource for that. If you're trying to be a designer because you think it's going to make you look cool, you can fuck all the way off. I don't want anything to do with you. One of the impetus behind us starting OK Decent as a brand was, believe it or not, there are a ton of really talented people here in town, for whatever reason, that don't have a spotlight on them. And we wanted to use it as a vehicle where we can partner with one of those creatives, whether you're roasting coffee or you do murals at one of these venues. what can we do together to kind of bring you a bit of shine? I've never been a subscriber of the thought that, well, I've arrived and I'm going to hold you back from getting here, right? Because I know how hard it was to get to where I am, especially looking the way I look. If there's someone else out there that can see me or Darby and say, holy shit, you can do that and call it a career, I want to do that. And then we want to be able to be a resource to help you do that. So this poster here, it's called Good Fucking Design Advice, was kind of the impetus of us deciding to create a manifesto. Because we both came from separate experiences within the design industry, whether it was advertising or working at other design agencies. Right. And we wanted to leave all that bullshit behind, but take what we know and following that and coming up with our own kind of manifesto of how we will operate.
Yeah, it was important for us to just kind of figure out what our own lane was going to be, but how to still be a viable company, right? The big win to me is that we have become an actually media agnostic studio, like between us and our friends, and we can build pretty much any product, right? Like, and so to Erik's point earlier, everything, it's all design, right? So we follow the same process for each one of those things. It's just solving problems and making it work and making it cool.